the first, I'm not even sure what the first step is on this, John. I mean, at some point we have to identify what it is we want to do with the parcel, and we're not even at that point yet. So, there'll have to be some public participation, since it's the community that owns this property.
My concern with using the COVID money, the ARPA funds, and I haven't had a chance to talk to Joe and David about this, versus maybe getting permission from town meeting to take out a loan from the CERC fund to develop this and then repay it, is that using the ARPA funds could restrict what we do with the properties. So there's certain things you can spend it on, economic impact or housing. Joe and David may come back and say, this is a better site for workforce housing, or a better site for affordable housing, or the housing won't work at all. So now we've spent $150,000 on what we've said is going to be an affordable housing project and developing that. And if we don't come out with that, I just don't know what, we may have to pay back the funding. So it kind of puts us down this rabbit hole of putting the cart before the horse, where I don't know if David or Joe, you guys have an opinion on that if we use the ARPA funds, and there's some real restrictions on it versus using a different funding source to pay for the project, we could get into a situation where maybe affordable housing doesn't work on this site, but we have to do it because we've already sunk in over $100,000 in planning money that's hooked to the idea that it will be an affordable housing project. Any thoughts on that versus using some other funding?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. Let me be frank. I'm skeptical that this project is eligible for the ARPA funding. Mm-hmm. The ARPA funding is very specific about what is required, and it needs to, let me back up for just a second. I'm not an attorney. I can't give you legal advice, and that's important to say. So as you consider how you might use the money, I think you should have an attorney who's familiar with the ARPA and has studied it give you that advice. I cannot. I can only tell you as a real estate professional who's dealt with a lot of federal programs over the course of my career, that as I read the regulations, that you need to be able to show that if you're dealing with economic impact, that there is a measurable and demonstrable economic impact that is proportionately greater than in other areas. And so that you've got to document that and have done some kind of analysis that shows it. One of the unfortunate parts of this program, as I understand it, the ARPA funding, is that you have no way of submitting your concepts to anybody to say, does this meet the standards? With some programs, you can. Here's what we're thinking of doing. Does this qualify? There's no such mechanism, as far as I understand it, in the ARPA program. It simply sets forth here, and there's some, if you want to do the research yourself, there are frequently asked questions out there. There's the interim final rule, but there's no process for that. It simply says, here are the standards, here's what you need to do. And as I read it, if you're in what's called a qualified census tract, that they assume that most housing and economic development things qualify. And I'm being very broad here, but you're not in a qualified census tract. And so you can do such projects outside of qualified census tracts, but you don't have the benefit of the assumption that you qualify to do these sorts of projects. You need to be able to document that you've got a proportionally greater impact, and they don't define how you do that. So there's risk there. And so you'd need to be able to show hypothetically, for example, that along Route 30 there on Depot Street, that has a greater impact than other areas. And that the project you're proposing also has to directly address that impact. And so I think I'm not saying it's impossible to do that, but it requires doing, I think, research. It would have to, and I'm not even sure how quite you do that, but we could, or Janet could, or whatever, you could as a municipality do that analysis and try to do it. I will be frank, I think it's a stretch. And I may be wrong. I don't know your specific circumstances intimately. And if in fact you've had, for example, more retailers close and you've got, you can measure somehow that retail sales have really fallen and that more restaurants have closed. And that
they've increased the sales.
David, can I jump in here? You've got to have data.
David, this could be though. I agree. It's interesting. We've lost some stores. We've replaced some stores. Our sales tax revenues are actually increasing, not decreasing. Funny enough. But this could be, Ivan, a situation where if you did take, exactly.
We just drew the same thing.
Okay, we're all sitting here just laughing because we're all pointing at the same thing. The replacement of revenues, we're eligible for about $133,000 from last fiscal year to take that and replace revenues. Once that goes into our general fund, the select board can redirect that with strings attached. So, so that would be, of all these projects, this is the one that when I talked to Katie Buckley at VLCT and we went through a bunch, there was one that we said that I asked her about, which was paving the Rec Park Road, because you can use it to repair damage to public parks as a point of increase. So increased usage caused damage to your parks. You can use it to repair that. She's like, no, I don't think that one's. So that was the one that was the no category. This one was the maybe category. But she said that it really came down to how you wrote it up. And like I was saying, it could hamper the redevelopment of, right from the get-go, it could hamper the redevelopment of the project by closing a door on a whole bunch of different options that we have because we use the ARPA funds, unless we took advantage of, what number is it? 6.1, provision of general services, replacing lost revenue. And then redirect that to the study of the board. I think this would be the one place you might want to do that.
Lost public sector revenue.
Yeah. But it's interesting, we're still in the process of the audit. It actually looks like, despite the fact that our revenues were down $133,000, we actually also had a fairly large surplus because it doesn't track expenses. It just says compare your revenues to the previous year. The revenues were down, but we also battened down the hatches so much and didn't spend money on some things. For example, we lost a bunch of Parks and Rec revenue, but we also lost the expenses that are always greater than the revenues. So we actually gained ground, even though we lost revenue, when you look at the net of the whole year. So you're still looking at probably a surplus from last year, even without the $133,000.
Logic would dictate that if we submit to receive $133,000 to replace lost public sector revenue, that we shouldn't use any of that money for something that would qualify under the other categories.
That's right, yeah.
Because that would go into the general fund to replace lost revenue. And once it goes into the general fund, my understanding is that there's no control over how we.
Yeah, then all of a sudden you basically shed all of the the 5 categories that you're supposed to limit investments to. It's that fact is very well documented from the National League of Cities to VLCT that that's a strategy that they're actually recommending as far as getting greater flexibility.
So if to complicate this even further, if ultimately the decision is to not relocate as far as the town hall goes, and we want to upgrade certain aspects of this facility, would any aspects of that qualify under the ARPA?
Yes, that would actually, because retrofitting, so the retrofits that we're talking about actually maybe making changes to the office spaces and how you enter them. That is actually an increasing filtration. That would be 100% eligible